One well-known argument for the existence of God is based on what's known as intelligent design. Intelligent design is the school of thought which says that certain things, certain biological systems, as well as the universe itself, show signs of having been very precisely designed, therefore making it implausible that these things would have occurred through purely naturalistic means. You normally hear about this in the context of biological systems, such as the bacterial flagellum or the blood clotting cascade. However, it also applies to the design of the universe itself, where the laws of physics, as well as the values of certain critical physical constants, have been set in a very precise way so as to support life. I cover that argument in my series of videos on cosmic fine-tuning. I also cover the various rebuttals that are given to that argument. Now, does intelligent design by itself demonstrate God's existence? Admittedly not. In fact, Sir Frederick Hoyle, an atheistic physicist, admits that the universe shows signs of incredible fine-tuning, and yet he's an atheist. He says that some super-intellect must have monkeyed with the laws of physics in order for it to be set the way it is so as to support life, but he declines to say that this is indeed God. What intelligent design does do is provide a starting point for further philosophical inquiry. In other words, if you can accept that certain things have been designed, or at the very least give strong indications of having been designed, then from there you can proceed to ask what the nature of this designer would be. Now, I don't want to cover examples of intelligent design in this particular video. That can be covered in other videos, and in part it was covered in some of my previous ones on cosmic fine-tuning. Today I want to talk about something known as unintelligent design. Some people argue that the world is filled with examples of poor biological design. They say, why do human beings die from disease? Why do human beings have sickle cell anemia? Why do they have all sorts of disabilities? Or they point to the human eye and say, the human eye is poorly designed. Look at that. You have your photoreceptors behind a layer of tissue. The octopus has a much better design. Its photoreceptors are right in front of the tissue, thereby giving it greater visual acuity. Or they point to DNA strands and say, information is encoded in DNA in such a horribly convoluted way. It's like spaghetti code. In other words, they say that the instructions encoded in DNA are encoded in such a convoluted way as to make it extremely difficult to unravel. No programmer would ever write such a thing. No competent programmer would. Or they point to examples such as coprophagia in rabbits. That's this rather disconcerting habit of theirs where they pass food through their digestive system once and then re-swallow it for digestion a second time around. That's in order for the bacteria to do their work on the food. To cut long story short, it's a habit that many people find disgusting, and therefore they view it as unintelligent design. Are these good arguments against intelligent design? Well, I'd like to make several observations here. First of all, these examples are only limited to biological examples. In other words, nobody that I've found, certainly no credible scientist that I've found, would point to the universe and say, the universe is badly designed. Quite the contrary. The appearance of cosmic fine-tuning is, by and large, uncontested, certainly uncontested among knowledgeable physicists. In fact, they try to explain it away by invoking, say, the multiple universe theory and the anthropic principle. I tackled the limitations and the failings of both of those in separate videos. To cut long story short, they don't really explain away the appearance of fine-tuning in the universe itself. Second, these instances of supposedly unintelligent design are limited to only certain examples. In other words, you could point to some examples of things that appear to have been badly designed. That does not negate the existence of things that have been well designed. So in order for the unintelligent design argument to dismiss the notion of a designer, or to even begin to dismiss the notion of a designer, it would have to cover all aspects of design, or all supposed instances of design in the biological sphere. Third, this argument assumes that if you see something that's been badly designed or suboptimally designed, that somehow there is no designer. And that's simply a fallacious argument. For example, if you come across a watch in a field and you find that this watch doesn't keep time very well, that it skips every other second, for example, you might ask, well, why would somebody have designed a watch so badly? No rational person would say, this watch cannot possibly have been designed. Similarly, when you see a biological system that appears to have been poorly designed, that alone does not suggest that there is no designer. Now it might be reasonable to ask, okay, why would somebody have created a flawed design? You might even ask, why would an all-powerful, all-intelligent being have created such a flawed design? But the existence of the flawed design itself does not negate the possibility of design. Again, let me remind you, the intelligent design argument does not in and of itself prove that God exists, nor do any careful philosophers make that claim. What it does is provide a starting point. So if you see a flawed biological system, you might ask yourself, okay, why would a designer, or let's say, why would a divine creator have created such a flawed design? But that itself does not, that question alone does not rule out his existence. Quite the contrary. I think we have good reasons for seeing that God, if he does exist, and I believe he does, can have reasons for allowing pain and suffering in the world, for example. This is not just empty speculation. First of all, this is a philosophical argument that's been well developed by Alvin Plantinga. And second, just look at the place in the world where the greatest revivals are occurring, where the greatest religious revivals are occurring. These are also places where you have the greatest amount of suffering. And talking about places like Korea, talking about places like Sudan, places where you have tremendous suffering and persecution. I've lived in the third world and I've seen what pain and suffering can do to drive people to God. As long as there are reasons why God might conceivably allow pain and suffering to exist, you can't rule out that possibility. And in a world where human agents have free will and must turn to or from God based on their own human volition, it's not hard to see why God might allow temporary pain and suffering for a greater, ultimate, eternal purpose.